So is running back just like a dead position now? And if so, are the Vikings approaching this in the right way? Let's get into it on Twitter Tuesday on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You like that on 3, 1, 2, 3, you like it!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, Luke Braun, and let's find some joy today. You can find this show wherever you find your favorite shows, whatever you listen to podcasts on, like SiriusXM. We're partnered with them. You can also find this show on YouTube or on Amazon Fire or Roku if you just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. Thank you so much to those of you who do listen to this show every single day. Appreciate y'all so much. Today is Twitter Tuesday. That means I'm answering your questions. You can send me questions whenever you want at Luke Brown NFL or at Locked On Vikings on Twitter. You can also send me questions to lockedonvikingspodcast@gmail.com, or there's a Google form in the show notes. You can just bookmark, fill that out whenever you got a question. I'll get to it sometime. The first question that I'm going to answer today is relevant to the day's events in the NFL. Andy, not Adam, asks, what's the deal with effective running backs now being paid less and less? Is supply and demand the main variable? That's a big one, always, right, in kind of any market. But basically, this is, if you have missed it all, the franchise tag deadline to renegotiate a new deal has expired. So at a certain point in the middle of the summer, which is happened on Monday, if you have been franchise tagged, you essentially have a little bit of time to like negotiate a new deal. It can be a time buying move. You can tag someone and then sign them to a real extension that you just needed a couple more days before they hit free agency to extend them. But if enough time passes, you just now are playing on that deal. And there's nothing the player can do about it. They can not show up to any negotiations at all. They can get the tag slapped on them, and now this is where they're playing or they're not playing at all. Unless the team wants to trade them, but it's up to the team. So that affects Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, and Tony Pollard, all of whom I think are players that probably think they deserve more than 10 mil. And I think that there's an argument to be made that those guys deserve more than 10 mil, considering if you look at the guys who are making more than that and where the market is and who those guys are. But not really here to debate that right now because it's not really a Vikings point. I did talk about it at length at Locked On NFL with Ross Jackson if you want to check that out. But to answer Andy's question, what is the deal with effective running backs being paid less and less? Yeah, so supply and demand is a huge part of it, right? And that's just like the economics. Essentially, for years and years and years, the high school world, there's not a lot of high school kids that can throw well. But there's a lot of high school kids that are just athletes. They're just total jocks that can run around and they're faster and more agile. I mean, we've been talking about how many of them on this show when we do the Everyman series, like Jalen Reagors, right? That just are the craziest athlete on the field. Just put the ball in his hands every play, and who cares about running routes? So you get a lot of running backs that if you're the most athletic kid in the school, you're probably playing running back unless you can throw. But if you can't throw, you're going to be a running back. And so you go to college as a running back, you go to the pros as a running back. It just means that college and high school produce a lot more running backs. The most athletic kids are running backs. So there's a lot of running backs. That creates, kind of this oversupply thing. And that means I don't need to pay $20 million for Saquon Barkley because I can get good running back play for a 6th round pick, even though that guy's probably a total nobody. I can get Ramondre Stevenson and I'm going to be okay. That guy's not a major pedigree player or anything like that, but it'll work. This has been well documented, but that's your supply and demand. So yes, I think that is the main deal. But there's also, I think, this sort of community-wide reckoning with running back as a position, which is, what does a running back actually do? What is running back actually for? And how do we better attribute their contribution to a play? Because in the olden days, you would, Chuck Foreman ran for 20 yards. Good job, Chuck Foreman. And you would say, good job, Chuck Foreman. Oh, yeah, the linemen, they blocked and they get, they're the unsung heroes, but good job, Chuck Foreman. You would attribute that in the newspapers. The number would be next to his name, And I think in the last few years, we've kind of realized, look, if the offensive line blocks this huge hole. The guy who ran through it didn't exactly do the hardest part of that. And I get it. But I think that is reductive and sort of affects things in the wrong way, because the impact that a running back has on a play is subtle and it's harder to pick out and it's harder to be reflected in something like, any production metric for sure, but even something like PFF grades, which I don't know if they're allowed to, if like graders are allowed to reflect those subtleties, like if they pressed a gap properly, did they burst through the hole properly, or did they just not really get credit because there was one? How much impact did the running back's pathing have in creating that hole, and how much impact did their quickness have in getting through it before it closed up? Kind of a subjective question, and so I kind of don't think that PFF's going to try to do that. So you're not going to have a great mapping with PFF grades either, I don't think, but I feel like there's effects that we sort of miss by saying, well, if there was a big hole and he ran through it, he clearly didn't do anything. And I'm not sure if that's entirely true. Either way, that has led to super, super depressed values. And now we're sort of in this major moment where Saquon Barkley can't get a contract. And that seems insane. He's Saquon Barkley. I don't know. I feel like eventually an equilibrium will be found here. But right now we're in this really weird stare down moment with all these guys that are kind of careening toward holdouts. Moving on, though, to the Vikings running back situation. Ryder47 says, is there any chance Dalvin Cook has a $7 million fallback offer from the Vikings? So I saw people discussing this rumor, but I could not find the source of it. I did not try very hard, to be honest. So I don't know where that rumor is from, if it's a credible source or not, but that feels right. That doesn't feel like the most outlandish thing in the world, right? If the Vikings offer a pay cut, say the one Harrison Smith took or the one Adam Thielen didn't, it is extremely responsible of them to say, hey, you don't take this, no hard feelings, go test the market. This deal is still on, because just because you said no to it in the first place doesn't mean we don't still want you for $7 million or whatever the amount actually is. If you want to leave, just know $7 million is still on the table. And if anybody else out there can beat $7 million, good on them. That's more than we want to spend. But if nobody can, we will still take you. We wanted you there 3 months ago. We still want you there now, right? So I could see it. I don't know if he comes back or anything like that. We'll see exactly what happens here. I think a lot of other dominoes need to fall. And honestly, Dalvin might be one of the first ones, because he's had one of the most active negotiating periods. Or maybe he's just looks more active to me because I'm more exposed to it, but who knows? Chris says, what is a rule or policy change focused on player safety that you would like to see implemented? I put this here in the mailbag because I think it is sort of related to the same thing. Like a player safety rule would be, hey, the Eagles tush push. I'm really curious to see what happens with that, because lowering your head and then being pushed from behind into somebody who's coming at you can be really, really, really dangerous. So I kind of feel they tried to talk about it a little bit at the competition committee this year. Nothing got picked up. I kind of feel like that conversation is going to get picked up again next year. We'll see. But for me, I'll take a roundabout direction, and I will say the NFL should have a stronger policy of paying for health insurance for their alumni. You don't need to come to me for this information. Go to the NFLPA and read up on the struggles that they had with alumni healthcare. And I mean, it's well documented the problems that alumni, especially from the 60s and 70s, are going through right now. The Bill Browns and Joe Capps, if you want some Vikings, and everything that they went through, and how little of it was covered by the NFL, who profited off of the direct cause of those problems. If I could change anything, I think that system could benefit players more and take the sting out of stuff like running backs not necessarily making that much money. Because if you people were talking about Phillip Lindsay made about $5 million in his career. I think he played 5 seasons in the league. That'll probably be more like $2 million once you've accounted for taxes and all the other expenses that go along with being an NFL player, paying your agent, stuff like that. And his medical expenses will probably blow that out of the water by the time he's, old enough to really need a lot of that. So I think that having some of that stuff comped will make it feel a little bit more like, oh, I did make $2 million in my 20s. And, you should be set for life, but not if your expenses from doing that are so great and you don't have the actual health coverage from the NFL. I would change that policy. I think that would be a really good thing for the game ultimately. And it would help assuage the whole concern about these are basically gladiators, and it's an entertainment product that we all get to cheer and clap for. But ultimately, I mean, people are taking years off their life. And there's a weird, you have to kind of reconcile with that however you can. And that would help. I have so many more questions to get to. I want to make sure that I get to them all. But before I do so, I'll talk to you about a good old Gramble. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and they're America's #1 sportsbook for a reason. They're safe, secure. The app is super easy to use. They pay out instantly when you win, and they have all kinds of interesting promos. So go to FanDuel.com every once in a while and just see if there's an interesting promo out there. Sometimes there's some stuff that'll blow your socks off. But for Locked On listeners, you can go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn right now and get up to $200 back in bonus bets, 10 times your first bet. So if you bet $20, you can get $200 back in bonus bets, regardless of how that other bet goes. That first bet, you could win it, lose it, you still get your $200 in bonus bets. You can get that at FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day every single day, especially to those of you who do listen every single day. Shout out if you can in the comments or whatever. Moving on with this Twitter Tuesday episode, the next question comes from Thursky, which I regrettably do not have a great answer to. Did the conditions for the Jesse Davis trade ever go through? Try as I might, I could not find the actual conditions for the trade. If anybody can find them, please leave them in the YouTube comments or tweet them at me. I could not find it to save my life. But my guess is with this kind of conditional pick, it's usually conditional on him being on the roster at a certain point, and he did spend the entire season on the roster. It might be you have to be on the roster for 2 years or something like that. Or, well, wait, Jesse Davis is a free agent now, isn't he? Yeah, so the rest of his deal expired. So I'm going to guess it wasn't based on that. I'm going to guess that it was based on him making the roster. So that would mean the Vikings do get the pick. It's a 7th rounder in 2025, so we're going to have to wait a little bit to find out. Or maybe somebody on the beat on either one of the beats can answer that question. I'm sure it is answered by now one way or another. But I couldn't find the specifics. The other way it could go down is it could have been snap counts. Like you have to play, start 3 games or play 200 snaps or something like that. Jesse Davis didn't take any snaps from scrimmage, had a few special team snaps, but never played on offense for the Steelers. So if that was the case, then he wouldn't have met the conditions. Not sure, but that's probably the nature of the system. Linwood says, one rookie other than Addison that has rookie of the year potential. I'm not sure if you're asking about Vikings rookies or overall rookies. Either way, the answers are pretty obvious. Overall, it's a quarterback, right? CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson, one of those two. Will Levis, if you want to get really spicy. One of those quarterbacks. If you are talking about the Vikings rookie class, that's a little harder. You would need, it's got to be an offensive guy. It's got to be somebody that is going to be on fantasy teams, right? So that basically leaves you Dwayne McBride and Jaron Hall. And the situations that lead to it for those two guys, I mean, defensive players are never going to win rookie of the year. If you want to look, like you could get like 1 million interceptions on Mekhi Blackmon or something like that. I don't really see that happening with any of the defensive players. I think the best bet would be some sort of miracle breakout by Jaron Hall, which probably has to be facilitated by Kirk Cousins getting injured or something like that. Or otherwise, having some long prolonged absence or playing so poorly he gets benched, which I think is like probably impossible. Or Dwayne McBride having the most ridiculous breakout you've ever seen and winning the award that way. Probably nobody though from the Vikings is the right answer. And overall, it's one of the first round, one of those top four picks at quarterback. RJ Frost asks, what do you think changed from the front office's approach of never going into an offseason needing a quarterback to now Cousins seemingly destined to leave next offseason? Or do you think that approach was simply misread generally? I think that's a misread of the approach. So I think that principle is still very much in place for the Vikings. It's more that like, don't go into an offseason not having options, right? I think whether or not Kirk gets an extension, and they're not going to, Kirk has already told us they're not going to really talk about it again until like February or March or whenever that deadline is for his contract voiding. if the Vikings bring him back, and shoot, he could hit free agency, then come back. I mean, there's all kinds of options there, right? I think it depends, though, on how this season goes. If this season goes really well, they could bring back Kirk just because, hey, this is working. Let's keep going. If this season goes really, really poorly, where the Vikings have, a top 5 pick, they're letting Kirk walk and they're using their top 5 pick on a quarterback. And then it doesn't matter. It's like, we're getting our quarterback, right? There's no world where we miss out on our guy because we pick high enough. Like, if that condition is satisfied, Kirk is walking. It's if you're in the middle, you pick 12th and you go, maybe we want you as a bridge, maybe we don't, maybe Jaren Hall is the bridge, and we feel okay about him competing with whatever rookie we get. What rookies are actually going to be first round prospects this year? There's like 10 of them that could be, but we'll see how all their final seasons go. It's a very deep quarterback class. I'm not sure if I love how high end the quarterback talent is. All of those things affect this, but really the principle is, I don't want to go into the draft picking 20th and needing a quarterback like my life depends on it. I don't want to have to Kenny Pickett this. That's where the Steelers were. They had to pick their favorite quarterback at pick 20. They luckily didn't have to trade up. But what if Kenny Pickett was taken? What if their next favorite guy was taken? And then, you end up that's how you get Christian Ponders, So I think that's the case. They want the option to say, you know what, we're not taking a quarterback this year. We'll roll with Kirk and we'll use our draft pick on something else because we don't like it. That's where they were this year, right? They didn't like Will Levis. They didn't like Hendon Hooker. And they said, you know what, we're not going to tie our franchise to these guys by making them first round quarterbacks just because we have to. Now we'll go into 2023 with Kirk and we can be respectable and we'll try this again in 2024. We have that option. Whereas if Kirk wasn't on the team, they probably would have had to pick Will Levis. And then they're not picking a quarterback next year. They have Will Levis. They might have the best quarterback in the draft on the board and they would pass on him because, hey, we just picked the guy last year. You don't want to be in that situation. Pick your spot. And I think that they're still adhering to that. But there's a lot of ways to manifest that. Drozo the Clown asks, which safety do you think will be starting opposite Hitman come week 1? Good question. What is starting? I would say the one that gets the most snaps is probably Cam Bynum. But hey, what if there's 3 safeties? Josh Metellus might be in. And then I think it's on Lewis Cine to upset that status quo, and I don't know if he's going to be able to do it. Casey Koulis asks, will Kirk Cousins join Brett Favre, Drew Brees, Peyton Manning, and Tom Brady as the only QBs to beat all 32 teams next year? He only needs Chiefs and Bengals. That is a lot. That's like 2 of the best teams on the roster. So I'm going to guess no. But shoot, anything can happen, right? He's got the opportunity to, but I don't think parlaying Vikings beat Chiefs and Bengals together is going to be a greater than 50-50 proposition. C. Woodbury asks, some teams during the season will upgrade their rosters by either being first in line to grab a player just waived or by selecting players from another team's practice squad. Have the Vikings been any good at this? And he asked for like recent examples. The one that always comes to my mind is Rashad Hill. He was a practice squad poach. Kairis Tonga, practice squad poach. Duke Shelley was like this too, right? But they didn't re-sign him. So yeah, they've been able to do a couple of examples of stuff like that. There's also your trade deadline things. Like you could technically count somebody like TJ Hawkinson. He came at cost, but it was still like team was trying to get rid of this guy. We jumped. In an easier to argue sense, somebody like Ross Blacklock. He was going to get cut, but the Vikings managed to trade nothing for him to get him in the building, and essentially trading meager day 3 draft capital for the negotiating rights, right? So I don't know. They've gotten some of it, but you shouldn't expect those kinds of guys to be anything but, the 5th, 6th string dudes at their position, special teamers, that kind of thing. Joshua Brook asks, what is the coolest number for a defensive end or outside linebacker? It could be 0, but it won't always be 0. Probably 99 is then the coolest number. I'm a big fan of 95, the Myles Garrett look. I think guys there with like numbers in the teens is a huge mistake. Something that they've recently been allowed to do. It makes them look like bad linebackers or like college players. I think it's a bit too much of a college thing. Anything in the 90s, I will be pretty stoked on. 99 and 0 are, I mean, 0 can be absolutely the sickest, coldest number ever if you're that kind of guy. Like, I don't know if that's Marcus Davenport, but if Davenport puts up 10 sacks in number 0, yeah, that's going to be one of the sickest looks in the league. If he puts up 0, it's going to be rough. This high risk, high reward picking 0 there. Edmund asks, what are the odds Hawkinson ends up second to JJ in all receiving stats this year? Interesting. So I think it would be pretty surprising if KJ Osborne out-received TJ Hawkinson. So I think this is TJ Hawkinson versus Jordan Addison. And so your question is, what are the odds Jordan Addison outproduces the tight end? Honestly, with what TJ Hawkinson did last year and how deep his routes were, I'm not sure. Or will they have Addison take that role over and do the things that they had TJ Hawkinson doing, but it was kind of suboptimal to have like a tight end running your deep dig? It feels kind of 50-50 to me. It's actually kind of hard to predict. It really depends on what you get out of Jordan Addison, which is really hard to predict. A couple more questions here on this Twitter Tuesday episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast. I'm going to make sure I get to all of them, so let's keep it rolling. Moving on with this Twitter Tuesday episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, Peter Larson asks a question. I get this at least once a year. What would a Vikings Super Bowl victory mean to you? Everything, right? I mean, that's the whole deal. That's the whole reason anybody lines up and does this. That's why you wake up at 5 a.m. and go do two-a-days, right? It's everything. I mean, for me, having covered the team, because this is like my livelihood now, I have had an easier time, I think, detaching myself from the actual result of the game. I can enjoy covering a loss a lot. Because if something interesting happened in it, or if there's something cool to talk about, like I can really get a lot of enjoyment out of that. And I mean, this is why I start the show now by saying find your joy, because I think that's an important thing of engaging with sports. Sports are a loser factory. It's one of my favorite YouTube videos of all time is a John Boyce video about the NCAA tournament, where you get 64 teams, 68 teams if you count the play-ins, with a dream and a singular goal, and 63 or 67 of them fail. And go home sad and disappointed. It's just what sports are. 32 teams come to the NFL, week 1, 0-0, thinking we got a shot to go shock the world. One of them gets to be happy. The rest of them are firing people. I think as sports fans, because that's the goal, and everybody agrees that that's the goal. There is nobody in the world, unless you start talking about like college teams, or I think there's a little bit of this in the NBA, but nobody in the world is going, yeah, you know what I'm into? I think I'd most like 9 wins and a first round playoff exit. Like, nobody says that, right? No, if you are arguing against that, you're arguing against nobody. Now, if you are the Texans and you get 9 wins and a playoff berth, you're going, oh, wow, this is on a better track than we thought. That's good news, but it's still good news in the context of how close it implies that you are to eventually winning the Super Bowl. For me, it would mean a ton, like personally. I mean, my grandpa, my dad, they've been watching since day one. Just one before I die, that whole thing, being able to get that. And I think it would fundamentally change the way, like my outlook on sports. I think the sort of longing and that back of your mind fear that what if I die before I ever see this is no longer there. And I think it'll remove some barriers in terms of engaging with the sport in a little bit less of an absolute way. I think people engage with it absolutely as Vikings fans right now. It's if this isn't them winning the Super Bowl, I'm not interested. You know, you kind of see that a little bit with if this is not them winning the Super Bowl. If they re-signed Kirk Cousins, okay, well, there's merits to that, and you know, on this show, I'll talk about it. You and I, we can discuss should they have, what was the price, shouldn't they have, what. But if that is a move that, if you don't think Kirk Cousins will win the Super Bowl, they extended him, and they go, oh, well, they're not going to win the Super Bowl in 2023. I'm no longer interested. Look at the replies to any Vikings things. Like, well, what'd you do in the playoffs, right? And that takes a lot of joy out of it for me. So I think if you can get a Super Bowl win under your belt at some point in your life, I think you'll be a little bit less inclined to be like, yeah, but is this going to be the thing that I've invested my time to see? And the real secret is, if you invested a lot of time in sports and you didn't see a Super Bowl win for your favorite team, you didn't waste your time. You still had a lot of fun, and you just got to figure out what that means to you. Cho asks, who would your top Vikings be to do a full biography about? Joe was talking about the history doc you can find on patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL. I did that last year. Very, very proud of it. Very, very excited for it. You can watch the whole thing. No paywall or anything like that. John Boyce, again, is actually doing his version of it, which is cool. When I did the history doc, I kind of did that after watching his Falcons documentary, and I thought, man, it'd be cool if there was a Vikings version of this. I want it to exist, and therefore I'm going to make it, which is, I think, the impetus to a lot of the things that I make is I don't see it out there, and I want it to exist, so I'm going to make it. That was the history doc. That's the Everyman series. I don't think we see enough people talking about the human side of these players, so I do it. And that's sort of the inspiration for a lot of the content ideas that I get. So I think applying that to, and by the way, I'm super excited about the John Boyce documentary for exactly that reason. I wished that there was a version of that, but for the Vikings, and now there will be exactly what I wanted. And from what I know about it, it'll be pretty different from mine. So I'm curious to see exactly how we approach the same sort of skeleton of the history of the Vikings, the moments you have to talk about, and how we approach them differently. I'm so stoked. I digress. If I did a full biography about two Vikings, I thought about this. I wanted it to be players I think are interesting, right? Players I think are, or players that haven't been covered to death. Like Alan Page is probably the most interesting person to ever be a Viking, but he's already got a football life. He's already got all kinds of stuff. I mean, he's in I think he talks in the 1969 America's Game missing rings thing. Like, he's been covered. That story is out there. If I want to experience Alan Page's story, I can. If I want to experience Joe Cap's story, I can't necessarily do that as easily. And Joe Cap, it's right behind me. He has an autobiography called The Toughest Chicano. It's very good. He wrote most of it, although his brain started to sort of melt with Alzheimer's until he got to the last chapter. So his son wrote the last chapter, which is very somber and an interesting way to sort of wrap up what is an absolutely phenomenal story. He is truly one of the most interesting people that you don't know enough about. It's actually one of my most popular history episodes of Locked On Vikings that I did last summer when I was doing the history doc was the profile of Joe Cap. People still comment on it and read it and listen to it to this day. I think that a full in-depth Joe Cap tell the story of this fists a flying sailor, tequila guzzling guy, like, he is so cool. I could go on about him forever. Go listen to that show too. He changed labor in the NFL. I mean, we have free agency and the way free agency looks, and the reason we're arguing about things today, like should there be a franchise tag or not, instead of should players be able to pick what teams they go to, it is very much because of Joe Cap and the inspiration he provided to players who striked in the 70s. So he's an easy one. The other one is actually also behind me. And part of this is, I can do a biography because they have written an autobiography, so I get to know their life story, but it's Robert Smith. This is one of this dude's insane. Robert Smith is an incredibly esoteric guy. And the early retirement is what a lot of people know about him, and why that happened makes so much sense when you get to know him. There's a very clear story to tell with Robert Smith and who he is. Another absolutely fascinating individual with all kinds of experiences outside of football. I mean, the football part of his life, the chapter of his life, and same with Joe Cap, the player chapter of his life, the time when he was a Viking, is a very small sliver of a life that both of these men led that has so much more worth telling to it that those would be definitely the two guys, especially Robert Smith's struggles with alcoholism and the way that he, like the personality that he kind of crafted afterwards and after football and all that, is a story that we could all take a lot from. I think it's really worth telling. Caden asks, The Athletic dropped a new podcast called The Play Callers that I would recommend to listen. I'm about halfway through that, by the way. I'm almost finished with I'm like halfway through episode 1, yeah. Throughout, they discuss the story of 4 head coaches in Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay, Matt LaFleur, and Mike McDaniel. As a Vikings fan, I was curious about Kevin O'Connell's role in Washington, as well as the role he played in the Rams Super Bowl year. So I know he gets like a small mention in it. I don't think I'm to it yet, and I think he'll get talked about more as the series wears on. but I'm not quite sure about his role in Washington. He was a quarterback's coach. He wasn't exactly part of the clique that was Shanahan and McDaniel and McVay and LaFleur. Those guys were like these four, they were like a very tight-knit group of people, Raheem Morris in that group, that kind of went from place to place together as coaching staffs kind of do. They sort of like moved together as groups. O'Connell in Washington, a little different versus, and in Washington after Kyle Shanahan left, and a lot of that staff went to Atlanta and kind of went their separate ways. Like Kevin O'Connell in Washington in 2019 is a much more interesting story. But his role in Sean McVay's offense was as a designer, as essentially a kind of creative play force. He would come up with the dishes, and on game day, Sean McVay would order off the menu. That was basically the way that worked in Kevin O'Connell, with him being the offensive coordinator there. So it was a lot of theory crafting and X's and O's and stuff like that. And then I think for O'Connell, very young guy in a lot of those staffs, I mean, you're not going to, it's a lot more learning than it is influencing and having, actual roles. So I think that was just sort of formative for him, those earlier years when all those guys were in Washington, sort of coming up with how do we use RG3 and stuff like that. I mean, at that point, O'Connell was still in the league. So, and like learning from Tom Brady and stuff. Yeah, it'd be interesting to talk to all the other people that he's come across in a similar kind of thing. And I think he will get more of a mention there. That is going to be everything that I answer on today's show. We'll continue with the Everyman series. We are going to have to do basically later in the week, I'm going to do like a rapid fire of a bunch of players who I couldn't find enough information about. So I'll cram them all into one, which I don't love doing. It's not really in the spirit of this series, but I ran out of time because camp is coming. So get excited, get into the swing of things. I hope you guys are everydayers, or if you're not, I hope you become everydayers as the season gets moving here. So I will see you all tomorrow. And as always, Skull.